Sally, could we have on screen, please, ARCH 609? So this is your evidence again to the Archer inquiry, Dr. Foster. And if we can pick it up at page 55. So from line 15 onwards, this was what you said. About 2 months later, in October 1986, a preliminary report from BPL was presented to the UK Haemophilia Centre directors, which suggested that 80 degrees dry heat treatment might be effective against non-A, non-B hepatitis. These preliminary results were not confirmed until 1988. Now, that's a reference to Dr. Smith's report of interim results, or an interim report of results. I can't remember exactly how it's titled. Now, that wasn't the first time in 1986, I think, that Dr. Smith had presented the interim data. So if we can pick things up in your evidence to the Penrose inquiry, PRSE 0000256. And we go to page 4. We can see under the heading response, you referred to a presentation on the 9th of May 1986 in Australia, which you describe as Dr. Smith reporting it's too early to know whether non-A, non-B transmission has been eliminated by severe dry heating. First of all, were you present at that conference in Australia, Dr. Foster?
I wasn't present at that particular symposium.
Okay. We know that the Dr. Smith's report was published. Did you see a copy of it at any time prior to its final publication?
No, I didn't.
Okay. Because I think it might be said, if we just look at what Dr. Smith said, that it was a little more optimistic than the summary suggests. So, than the quote suggests. So if we go to WITN 69144063. And we go to page 3. And we look at the last paragraph, please, under the heading discussion. You've quoted in your statement, Dr. Foster, the last sentence, it's too early to know whether non-A, non-B transmission has been eliminated, etc. But it's right to note Dr. Smith was rather more positive if we look at the whole paragraph, was he not? Where it says, although these are only interim results in a limited number of batches, we think we are justified in thinking that the severe heating has been more effective in preventing transmission of non-A, non-B hepatitis than the milder heating accorded to Highland and Armour products in studies published last year. Would you accept that what the results were positive in the way in which Dr. Smith describes?
Yes, they were promising results.
And then I think there's some evidence to suggest that Dr. Smith had given an update earlier in 1986 about those results, which is PRSC 303764. This is Dr. Perry's note of a meeting held at the PFC on the 17th of March 1986 between representatives of BPL and representatives of SNBTS, including yourself. If we go to page 2, we've got the heading towards the bottom of the page, virus inactivation studies. And then if we go over the page and look at paragraph 5 towards the bottom of the page, it says, Dr. Smith outlined clinical trial results of the 8YF8 products so far. While results cannot be considered conclusive at this stage, he indicated that no cases of virus infection have occurred attributable to 8Y material after 12 months experience of 8Y in virgin haemophiliacs. Was this meeting in March the first time you'd heard from Dr. Smith along these lines?
I think it probably was.
And can you recall if you had any further discussions or conversations in the course of the first half of 1986? Or
I can't recall. I did expect Dr. Smith to make a presentation at the main conference in Australia, which I did attend, but there was no presentation. And because I hadn't been aware of the previous presentation, I had, to some extent, assumed that perhaps the results weren't as good as they had started out to be.
Can we then look, please, at your witness statement? So, WITN 6914001. And go to page 43. I just want to pick up at the very bottom of the page and then over to the top of the next page. You said this: Dr. Cash did ask me in 1985 if I thought a non-A, non-B hepatitis clinical safety study should be carried out with PFC's factor 8 that was dry heat treated at 68 degrees for 24 hours. I advised him against this, as I did not believe that this product was safe from non-A, non-B hepatitis transmission. Dr. Cash agreed with my advice. Is it fair then to understand, this is 1985, I don't think anything would have changed by 1986, that it was generally understood within SNBTS that the product currently being produced, although effective in relation to inactivation of AIDS, was not safe from non-A, non-B transmission?
That's correct.
And then if we could go to page 118 of this, sorry, can we have the document back on screen, Sally? WITN 6914001. And go to page 118. You were asked halfway down the page to identify any further factors that delayed the provision of Z8 to patients in Scotland and Northern Ireland. And you've drawn attention to a point in relation to the batch dedication system. So you refer to the batch dedication system continuing in place for another 12 months. Batch dedication involved each patient being allocated a specific batch of factor 8 concentrate, which they would continue to use until it was finished, thereby reducing the number of donations to which they were exposed. This decision meant that the provision of Z8 to patients in Scotland and Northern Ireland was delayed until their current batch of SNBTS factor 8 had been used up. And then you suggest in the next paragraph, your memory was that the decision was taken because of continued uncertainty over Z8 being free from transmission of non-A, non-B, and there being greater confidence in the merit of batch dedication. Do you have any further reflections on the decision, or presumably by haemophilia clinicians, to continue with the batch dedication system rather than potentially an earlier switch to Z8? Do you recall having any particular concerns about that at the time?
I would say at the time I actually wasn't aware that that was the reason for the decision. This was dealt with by Dr. Perry and haemophilia directors themselves. It was only later that I realised that they were concerned to keep the batch dedication system in place. I don't think it changed the timescales very much, because by this time we had hardly any of the previous product left, because we'd stopped manufacturing it in the middle of 1985. Sorry, middle of 1986.
Okay, well, I can pick that up perhaps with Dr. Perry if I need to. We can take that down now, thank you. We know, of course, that PFC products were used in Northern Ireland as a result of the arrangements that for the fractionation of Northern Irish plasma. Do you know whether any investigation was undertaken by the PFC or by SNBTS as to the number of HIV and HCV infections that may have been caused by PFC products used in Northern Ireland?
No, I have no knowledge of any investigations.
Do you know the extent to which or over what period PFC products may have been used in England and Wales either in the late 70s or in the first half of the 1980s?
There was a period in 1984 where we discovered that we had such large stocks of Factor 8 that some of it was about to outdate, and Dr. Perry made arrangements for that to be transferred to England to reduce the dependency on commercial products.
And do you know whether any investigations was ever undertaken by PFC or SNBTS as to whether any infections were caused by PFC products in England and Wales?
I'm not aware of any investigations.
Can we then look, please, at PRSE 40643? This is a letter to the Lancet, August 1988, which reported non-A, non-B hepatitis transmission by intravenous immunoglobulin. There is, I think, an earlier document which references this. Details of which I can't currently locate, but in any event, we can probably deal with it by reference to this letter. So is it right to understand that an immunoglobulin manufactured by PFC transmitted non-A, non-B hepatitis?
That's correct.
And how did that come about, that happened?
To be honest, we'd never found out. We assumed that it must have been some form of cross-contamination after the virus inactivation step had been carried out.
And then if we can go to a completely different topic and completely different document, PRSE 0001953. This is a letter from you to Professor Cash, 5th of November 1991. It says, Dear John, last week I attended a meeting of the Edinburgh HIV discussion group, the main speaker being Christopher Ludlam on the Edinburgh haemophilia cohort. What was the Edinburgh HIV discussion group?
I actually can't remember what it was. It was a meeting that was drawn to my attention and I thought it worthwhile attending, but I can't say I knew what the term HIV discussion group meant.
And then you say, I was rather taken aback by Christopher's presentation, believe you should at least be aware of some of the statements that he made. One, he began by pointing out that there was a group of SNBTS staff present and that he would therefore have to toe the party line. Did you have any understanding either at the time or resulting from you flagging this up to Professor Cash or more generally looking back now as to what was meant by towing the party line, what Dr. Ludlam thought the party line for SNBTS was?
I don't really have an explanation. It just seemed a strange thing to say. I wasn't sure if it was a joke or not, but it did seem an odd thing to say.
It then continues by referring to a slide of SNBTS Factor 8 as being described as crud. And then point 3 says that Dr. Ludlam's main thesis was that an allo-antigenic protein modulates the immune function of haemophiliacs, explaining everything from susceptibility to HIV infection to the increased incidence of inhibitors seen with high-purity products. It was disappointing that he largely ignored the growing body of evidence which does not support his hypothesis. What was your understanding of what Dr. Ludlam was saying here?
My understanding is that he was very keen for a more highly purified product to be developed. And although we had been working on that, we had suspended that project in favour of introducing the 80-degree dry heat treatment, which was applied to a much lower purity product. He was still concerned that the patients were suffering because of something in the Factor 8 that wouldn't be there if it was a very high purity product. And I think he was maybe disappointed that we had shelved that project or not brought it forward sooner.
How does that fit exactly if he was saying that there was an increased incidence of inhibitors seen with high purity products.
That was some high purity products did do that, so that it's not at all straightforward.
So this isn't simply a question of saying high purity good, anything else bad.
No, it's not.
Was it in part your understanding of the thesis that was being advanced was that somehow the SMBTS factor 8, or indeed factor 8 perhaps more generally, reduced or affected the immune function of those with haemophilia, somehow rendering them more susceptible to HIV?
That was Professor Ludlam's point of view. I think we were more open-minded. There were suggestions that the immune disturbances that were being seen could be caused by hepatitis C. And now I would say that probably was the cause of this. But at the time, that wasn't accepted by Dr. Ludlam.
And then the fourth point was in relation to heat treatment. You say that Dr. Ludlam argued that our early heat treatment procedure described as genital warning was a complete waste of time. He stated that the lack of infection in patients treated with batches known to be HIV contaminated was probably a result of the particular patients not being susceptible to infection with HIV. Were you aware of any concerns about the early heat treatment procedure that Dr. Ludlam's there referring to? Concern that it was a waste of time as described there. Was that ever drawn to your attention at the PFC at the time, either by Dr. Ludlam or by anyone else?
No, I think that people were pleased that we were heating factor 8 as soon as we did. We knew that the heat treatment wasn't as severe as was now being done by other organisations. We had by this time moved into 80-degree heat treatment. We'd advanced our heat treatment from 68 to 2 hours to 68 to 24 hours. And that, as far as we were aware, had been effective against HIV, which is what this is concerned with. And what puzzled me was that Dr. Ludlam had authored a publication in which he actually made that point, that treatment had prevented infection with HIV in his patients.
Can you also help with the second sentence in paragraph 4? The lack of infection in patients treated with batches known to be HIV contaminated.
Yes, after testing for HIV was brought in for donors, SMBTS did find donors who were HIV positive, but that wasn't long after we'd introduced heat treatment. And as soon as those donors were found to be HIV positive, we looked back through the records to see what had happened to those donations, and we did identify batches of factor 8 which they'd been included in, which had been heat treated and which had not transmitted HIV. And that's what Dr. Ludlam had published.
But this sentence then goes nowhere towards making any of his points.
No.
Because one has to assume that his point about the alloantigenic protein, which changes the immune system of haemophiliacs, makes them more susceptible to HIV, still requires there to be HIV to be susceptible to.
Yes.
And it's not quite the same as the explanation which at one stage is being put forward as the whole cause of HIV, which was protein overload.
That's correct.
Yes.
Can I then ask you to look at...
What was the reaction of the audience to this?
The audience weren't as aware of the details as I was. I don't really remember much beyond that. My concern was that Dr. Ludlam was a very important doctor, and we had a very good relationship with him, and we wanted to maintain that relationship. And I thought John Cash should know that Dr. Ludlam had reservations, just to find out what they were so that we could assure him that we were doing the best we could for his patients.
Can we then go to MACK 0002301_022, please? This is an email from you to Dr. Perry, 11th of January 2000. We go to the bottom half of the page. If we pick it up on, if you leave the screen where it is, Sally, the 5th paragraph down from what we can see on the screen, it says this: of the various heated products approved in the UK during the period in question, hepatitis transmissions have been reported for. And then if we look at what you say in relation to ARMA, you say ARMA, heat-treated factor VIII, 18 HIV transmissions published in 1988 and 1990, plus 2 in Scotland not published. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, it says in his statement for the Sunday Times inquiry, Mike, that I think was Dr. Mike McGovern, seems not to be aware that ARMA's factor VIII was withdrawn from the UK in October 1986 following HIV transmissions in the UK, 4 cases in Birmingham and 2 in Glasgow's Royal Hospital for Sick Children. So it appears from this it was your understanding that the heat-treated ARMA factor VIII had caused 2 HIV transmissions amongst patients at York Hill. Is that correct?
That was my understanding.
And do you recall how you'd learnt of this?
Yes, we were at a meeting in Glasgow, probably Glasgow Royal Infirmary, and near the end of the meeting, Dr. Ian Hann came in and told us that 2 patients had been infected with a heat-treated factor VIII concentrate and had contracted HIV. And I can't remember anything else now, but certainly he did tell us that at the time that they'd had these infections. And we were quite surprised, taken aback that should have happened.
And then the first bit I read out of that, the bit that has plus 2 in Scotland not published, do you know why they had not been published?
No, I don't know, but I mean, it was up to the doctors to decide whether they would publish something or not, so I have no idea. I would add to this now that when Lord Penrose looked into these the infections in Scotland, these weren't identified in his report. So it's conceivable that I picked up this wrongly, but that's what I wrote at the time. That's what I believed at the time.
Well, I think that may answer the next question I've been asked to raise with you, which was this disclosed to any of the Scottish inquirers, and if not, why not? But it may be that you can't answer that.
Yes, that would be my answer.
Yeah. Can I then just go back, we can take that down, thank you, more generally to some of the earlier questions I asked you about heat treatment. Picking up upon the question asked of you by the chair in relation to stabilisers and albumin, it may be said, it may indeed be submitted in due course, that had the PFC or fractionators more generally put greater priority on heat treatment of factor VIII, they could have conducted experiments with stabilisers earlier and found an appropriate stabiliser earlier. What, if any, response to that do you have?
My response is that I think the overwhelming view was that factor VIII was so sensitive to heat treatment that this wouldn't be possible. And certainly, even going back to Dr. Cohn's time, studies have been done to try to extend his work to other products, and it failed. I have to also point out that I was by no means an expert on coagulation, and it takes a long time to get your head around the complexity of this subject. And I was really, in the 1970s, certainly still learning the subject.
These are hypotheticals, obviously, but if an appropriate stabiliser had been found at an earlier stage that would effectively enable there to be heat treatment, in very broad terms, what would the next stages of product development then be, or would then have been?
Depends on the stabiliser, whether it's physiologically acceptable or not. If it's not, then you've got to remove it from the protein, and that itself can be very difficult, especially as processes for purifying factor VIII hadn't been devised.
Putting it then again more generally, and this may be in due course a submission that's made to the inquiry, it could be said that if greater efforts had been made in the 1970s to find a method of viral inactivation applicable to factor VIII, then these could or would have been successful, given that we know there were indeed such methods that did later prove to be successful. Do you have any observations on that?
I think it's unlikely. I know that when Horst Swinn made his discoveries, they were based on serendipity. He didn't set out to do this. He set out to try and remove fibrinogen, to separate fibrinogen, to make that product more soluble. And he tried everything he could think of. And as a last resort, he tried heating the fibrinogen to see if he could make that insoluble and somehow remove it from the factor VIII. And that didn't work. And he just carried on trying all sorts of additives. And it was quite remarkable what he achieved, but it was largely based on serendipity.
You told us earlier your understanding was that the Beringwerk approach was discovered by accident. Are you able to tell us what the basis is for that?
That's kind of what I just described. It was he set out to do something else and eventually got in a different place altogether. But even then, the yield was so low that it wasn't a proposition that could be generally applied immediately. It required further research to understand why factor VIII was so unstable, and then to address that point as well.
The last topic I have just arises out of some of the evidence given to earlier inquiries. If I can ask you to look first of all at WITN 3431004. This is an email exchange between you and Dr. Perry, and I think Dr. Douglas also copied in anticipation of you and Dr. Snape giving evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal. Now, I'm not going to ask you about what it was that Dr. Perry was saying here, because I can ask Dr. Perry that next week. But if we look at the middle email, which is from you to Dr. Douglas and Dr. Perry, in the second paragraph you say, if there are any differences between BPL and ourselves, they're likely to be of emphasis and omission, as the basic facts are pretty well established. Nevertheless, a lay tribunal could give particular emphases more importance than they deserve. Hence the importance of SMBTS eventually being given permission to present our own evidence to the tribunal. What did you mean by the importance of SMBTS eventually being given permission to present its own evidence to the tribunal?
When I was first approached to give evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal in person, the Scottish Health Department declined. They didn't want me to give evidence in person. They wanted me to make some kind of legal deposition, and I wanted to give it in person. I didn't really want to have to go through the rigmarole of a deposition. And I think the problem was that at this point, the SMBTS was under investigation by the Scottish Executive, and that investigation hadn't been completed. And I think they were concerned that really they should wait until their investigation had finished before I should be allowed to talk about these things in another legal situation. But eventually they were persuaded to relent by I think one of the Health Minister of Ireland got in touch with his counterpart in Scotland and said, look, we really want Dr. Foster to give evidence in person, and so they relented, and then I was allowed to do that.
And why did you consider it important for SMBTS to present evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal?
Because I felt that we should be open about anything to anybody.
If we can look then at PRSE 0003480. So this is one of the reports put together, I think, for the Penrose inquiry. Is this right? Events concerning the safety of blood and blood products with special reference to the treatment of haemophilia, October 2009. Was this a report which, to which you made a significant contribution? Were you the main author of it?
I certainly wrote or drafted a fair amount of it, yes.
If we go to page 5, we've got the heading introduction. The first 2 paragraphs talk about haemophilia and the consequences of haemophilia. The third talk about the ability of a person born with haemophilia in the UK within the last 20 years being able to enjoy a normal life expectancy, etc., be free from disability from infection by blood-borne viral pathogens. This achievement is the result of scientific and medical advances that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s. It might be said that that's ignoring the contribution that cryoprecipitate made to the lives of those with haemophilia before the 1970s. Do you have any observation to make on that?
I was writing this obviously from a PFC perspective and about how we'd gone on to make the product safe. And of course, cryoprecipitate was never made safe. So I didn't deal with that. This document was reviewed and contributed to by Professor Franklin, who himself had been a haemophilia director. So I would have left that aspect of it to him.
And then if we look at the rest of the page, please. So from the SNBTS contributed to these advances. There are a number of contributions by SNBTS. They're articulated: self-sufficiency, prompt introduction of dry heat treatment, key discoveries in the development of a more severe dry heat treatment. And then as a result of these achievements, and 4 matters are set out: the HIV safety of the Factor 8 issued from December 84, Scotland the first country in the world to supply HIV-safe Factor 8 in sufficient quantity for the treatment of all its patients, SNBTS Factor 8 safe from hepatitis C before the virus 2 years before the virus responsible was discovered, Scotland 3 years ahead of any other country in the world in supplying HCV-safe Factor 8 sufficient for the treatment of all its patients. If we just go over the page, we'll see that it then goes on to a more detailed exposition. So if we go back to the previous page, it might be said, Dr. Foster, that this was presenting a somewhat optimistic view of SNBTS's role without identifying any of the things which potentially SNBTS might have done differently or better, without recognising that a number of haemophiliacs were infected with HIV and hepatitis C through Scottish products, that SNBTS might have been able to do things differently or better in relation to donor screening and selection. Something of a rose-coloured spectacles view. Do you have any observation in relation to that?
It was not intended to be anything more than just a very broad overview, knowing that Lord Penrose would be investigating these matters in considerable detail.
And then, I won't go through the rest of it in any detail, but if we just go to the concluding remarks on page 45. There are a series of observations there set out. They conclude, if we go over the page, with the suggestion of SNBTS was at the forefront of these medical advances, enabling Scotland to lead the world in making safe products for the treatment of haemophilia widely available. We just go back to the previous page. No, sorry, page 45. Thank you. The third bullet point asserts that the value of treatment with concentrates was generally accepted to greatly outweigh the known risk of hepatitis infection, and then reference to the emergence of AIDS presenting transfusion services worldwide with unique challenges. What was the basis, the factual basis, for the assertion in this report that the value of treatment was generally accepted to greatly outweigh the known risk of hepatitis infection? Is that something that you were observing from yourself?
It's something that I'd read in numerous publications by clinicians from Dr. Biggs onwards.
And when you wrote or co-authored this, who were you referring to when you talked about the value of treatment with concentrates being generally accepted to greatly outweigh the known risk of hepatitis? Accepted by whom?
By the medical doctors who were making judgments about risk and benefit.
Thank you. Then just a couple of final questions, if I may, Dr. Foster. Would it, in your view, have been useful to have a UK-wide body which brought together fractionators and haematologists in the 70s and 80s?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by haematologists.
Well, let me narrow it down. So it's a question I've been asked to ask you, so let me reformulate it slightly. A UK-wide body, so not limited to either England and Wales or Scotland or Northern Ireland, but across the UK, that's one element of it. And the second is that it brought together those involved in fractionation, those involved in the collection of plasma, so blood transfusion directors, and those involved in the use clinically of blood and blood products?
Probably the answer is yes. I mean, we had that in Scotland, and I don't think that existed in England. So I think the experience in Scotland was a benefit to us, and I think if it had been adopted more widely in the UK, that would have been of benefit.
And when you say you had that in Scotland, you had an element of it in the sense you had PFC as part of SNBTS.
We also had annual meetings with combined with SNBTS directors, PFC director, officials from the Scottish Health Department and haemophilia directors who met annually and who had working party meetings in between the annual meetings. And I don't think that same arrangement existed in England.
And then the final question really harkens back to what I asked you about the extent to which information from commercial pharmaceutical companies was available to you about what research and development works were ongoing within those companies. Over the years since the 1980s, did the situation improve in terms of the ability to know what research and development was being undertaken in pharmaceutical companies, or has it very much remained something which, in your experience, pharmaceutical companies have kept to themselves and only drip-fed information?
I would say the latter, that it's still very much commercially sensitive information.
Looking at it from a public health or patient safety perspective, would it, in your view, be a good thing if there were mechanisms which enabled a better sharing of information about developments, such as the developments in relation to heat treatment?
Yes, it would obviously have been to everyone's benefit if that knowledge was generally available, especially from what has been done in the commercial sector. I'm sure that would have been helpful.
So those are the questions I'm currently proposing to ask, but although I had some questions over lunch from core participants, I haven't had a proper chance to consider them yet. And we ought to give a further opportunity in any event. So could we take a half-hour break now?
Well, we will in a moment, but not just now, because I'm going to ask a question myself, which may give rise to further, depending on the answer, obviously, further questions. And it's this. Can we just go back to PRSE 303480? And you were taken there, first of all, to page 5. Yeah, where you set out the achievements of SNBTS. I say you, the authors, you weren't the sole author, and the results of those achievements. Scotland being the first country in the world to supply HIV-safe factor VIII in sufficient quantity for the treatment of all its patients. Safe from hepatitis C 2 years before the virus responsible was discovered, 3 years ahead of any other country in the world in supplying HCV safe factor VIII sufficient for the treatment of all of its patients. Can we look again at the page 45, at the conclusions? The very bottom, second last bullet point, you repeat Scotland was the first country in the world to make heat-treated factor VIII safe from HIV available to its whole population and turnover. Next page, please. Can we just enlarge that next page? Thank you. And Scotland, you say, led the world in making safe products for the treatment of haemophilia widely available. What is implicit in that is that England and Wales did less well. Why do you think England and Wales did not do as well as Scotland?
I think we were all trying to make advances in areas that were very difficult. We had advantages of having more plasma so that we had more factor VIII available to be able to. When we first heat treated our factor VIII, we had a year's supply that we could heat treat. That meant we had all of that material available to distribute to patients and to fill the supply chain. And the same when it came to hepatitis, dealing with non-A, non-B, we had more, because we were self-sufficient, or almost self-sufficient, we could supply all of the patients with the product. BPL couldn't because they were only meeting about 30% of the needs of their patient population. So even if they were ahead of us with a hepatitis C safe product, they weren't providing that to their population because they were nowhere near self-sufficient. So that goes back to the questions of self-sufficiency that you've dealt with earlier.
So you attribute the relative, I stress that word, poor performance of England and Wales to the failure there to achieve self-sufficiency.
Yes, I would say that's what I'm really suggesting.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, if we could take a half-hour break.
Yes, well, we'll do that. We'll come back slightly more than half an hour, perhaps, at 3:15. The purpose of this, Dr. Foster, is that there are a number of core participants, many of whom will have been watching online, some of whom are here, or are represented here, who will have questions that they want to put through their legal representatives to Council, and Council will ask you those questions when we return. I can't tell you how long you're going to be kept. Could be short, could be long, depends on the number of questions. But we'll come back at 3:15 and find out.
Thank you.